И мы будем... И я очень рада встрече с вами в этом древнем городе. И мы будем обсуждать с вами по социальному развитию и также оценивать, какие методы, какие подходы применили. И в AIIB мы знаем, какими проблемами сталкиваются развивающие страны, и какие у них технические потенциалы, стандартизации, регулировки стандартов и так далее. И, конечно же, мы можем добиться эффективных результатов только посредством сотрудничества и также развивать на экономический потенциал. Этот семинар, в этом семинаре включены также
Mr. Yusuf Muranga, Minister of Finance and Economic Panel and AIIB Governor for Rwanda, delivering the keynote speech. Thank you so much, sir. Moderating today's discussions is Dr. Yukon Huang, Senior Fellow at Cambridge Endowment for International Peace and a member of AIIB's International Advisory Panel. We are also privileged to have with us Mrs. Dipali Khanna, Vice President, Asian Regional Office, Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Prasanna Salyan, Director, Ministry of Finance, India, and alternate Director on AIIB Board, and Mr. Andrew Cross, our Chief Financial Officer, who will contribute their valuable perspectives. I'm sure the insights will enrich our understanding of how multilateral development banks can assume a leading role in shaping the future of the infrastructure investments, ensuring they are sustainable, inclusive, and closely aligned with long-term development priorities. And with that, I know we have a very interesting time ahead, so I would like to start off in joining me in welcoming Mr. Yusuf Muranga for his keynote speech. Please. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Rajat, for putting this together. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it's an honor to address this important session. And good quality infrastructure is very important for any country, but it is specifically very important for developing countries. Investing in infrastructure is important in sustaining economic growth and development for most countries. Without continuous investment in infrastructure, growth and development opportunities in most countries cannot be optimized. In Rwanda, we've come a long way since the 1994 war and genocide against the Tutsi, where in 1994, Rwanda lost almost everything. We lost about 1 million people, but we lost a lot of social and economic infrastructure. Between 2000 and 2006, because of the context, between 2000 and 2006, we focused on very basic social infrastructure to begin with. However, we quickly realized that focusing on basic social infrastructure was not sufficient to address our economic growth and development needs, to reduce poverty and improve livelihoods of our people. We had serious transport infrastructure challenges. We had very serious electricity challenges. We had water and sanitation challenges. We had challenges with schools. We had challenges with hospitals. We had challenges with hospitality facilities for tourism. We had challenges with agriculture infrastructure for irrigation, production, and post-harvest handling, among others. In 2007, we developed a development program, and we started expanding the focus to include critical infrastructure that we thought we really needed to develop our economy. But then we quickly realized there are very many constraints. Soon after we wanted to expand the scope, we quickly realized that there were many constraints, and among the constraints was we didn't have enough capacity in government to conceive and prepare convincing and bankable infrastructure projects. We also had capacity challenges to engage development partners and financial institutions that are supposed to finance the projects. We also had capacity challenges to procure and implement the projects on time. There were also risk-averse financing partners that were not willing to finance, especially new infrastructure projects. We had weak project and stakeholder governance arrangements in the country. We also had limited capacity in documentation processes for the infrastructure projects, communication and transparency issues. And there was also a problem with long procedure requirements by financing partners. So projects, infrastructure projects will take a very long time to fulfill procedures, first of all to be accepted, then to be implemented. The list was long. However, we managed to address most of these issues and implemented many projects successfully. And today, the effect is very clear. The economy of our country grew at a very high rate, and today we can see the results in terms of development. For example, in the last 10 years, because of the investments in, for example, electricity infrastructure, electricity production has been increasing on average 9% per year in the last 10 years. And this has led to access to electricity for households, for lighting, from around 4% in 2000 to around 70% by the end of last year. So because of the consistent investment in electricity infrastructure, access to electricity has improved from 4% to 75% by the end of last year. And we intend to have 100% access to electricity by the end of 2030. So we are continuing to invest in electricity generation infrastructure. We no longer have load shedding. We used to have a lot of load shedding in the past. We no longer have load shedding. And the economy has been growing for the last 10 years on average 7% because of investment in good agricultural projects. But most importantly, post-COVID-19, since 2021, the economy has been increasing on average every year by around 8% since then. As we develop, we face new realities that need more investments in infrastructure. I'll give one example, one very important example. because of the good ecosystem that we've developed around many things, for example, tourism, the MICE industry, meetings, conferences, and events, and transitioning transit business in Rwanda to connect to other African regions. Air transport has increased on average in the last 10 years by 31% on average every year. But when you look at the last 5 years, it has been increasing by 38% every year. So this has created a lot of stress to our airport infrastructure, and our facilities at our airport are struggling to handle the traffic. And automatically this calls for even more investment in air transport infrastructure. So this shows that to continue developing and sustain the growth that we see, we need to continue investing in good infrastructure projects. However, when we realize that we now want to start again investing in air transport infrastructure, the old challenges still persist and come back. You still find it very difficult to engage financial institutions to convince them that this is an important project. Yet the numbers and the vision are clear. So these hurdles always come back. It is therefore important that multilateral development banks put in place mechanisms to support countries address access to investment finance challenges in an efficient and timely manner. In Rwanda, we say that development delayed is development denied. We've been having discussions at country level, and we see that it took us 30 years to come from GDP per capita of 250 to 1,000. And our leadership and all of us don't think that we should spend another 30 years to come from 1,000 to 2,000. So we don't want to delay with investment projects. Since 2020, on a positive note, we've had very fruitful collaboration with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Since 2020, when we joined, the bank was very swift in finalizing 3 investments collaborations. This was at the peak of COVID-19 in 2020. That's when we joined. And the bank moved very quickly to finalize collaborations and provided 3 facilities. The first one was a COVID-19 recovery facility that came in very quick during 2020. The other facility was investment in accelerating access to clean energy. We still have a lot of challenges for clean energy, especially for cooking, and also investments in digital connectivity acceleration for the country. We also have many pipeline projects that we are working on together with the bank, including, for example, financing investments in infrastructure, air transport infrastructure. And would want to say that the bank's approach in Rwanda and countries overall is very pragmatic. We really appreciate the way we worked with the bank since 2020 when we joined. The approach is very pragmatic, very accommodative, and very swift. We are very happy with the collaborations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Muranga, for that very inspiring turnaround story of Rwanda, and we are very glad to be a partner in your development and look forward to doing much more. And with that, may I request our panelists to please join us on the stage, and I will hand over the mic to Dr. Yukon Huang. Thank you.
I want to check whether I'm skilled enough to turn on the microphone. Oopsie. It's all right. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me begin by noting the theme of this session, maximizing returns to infrastructure investment. This issue is not new. It's been around for practically forever. But what makes it timely? And I would say there's actually three factors today that makes this issue particularly important. First, I sit in Washington, D.C. Both the United States, Europe, developing countries, everyone believes that strengthening infrastructure investment is the key to productivity increases and growth. But there's a problem. If you look at the forecasts, investment rates in the future are projected to decline. They will be significantly lower than what has been the case for the past several decades. So how are you going to increase growth with declining investment levels? Moreover, you have a problem. Fiscal debt problems are affecting both developed and developing countries. Climate change issues have soared. Technology tensions, geopolitical considerations are reducing returns to investment globally. This makes it extraordinarily important that multilateral development banks and borrowers figure out how can you increase the returns to investment. When I was preparing for this session, and I was looking at various commentary, I came across this article in The Economist magazine. The headline commentary was the following: How to Get Infrastructure Right. The Economist editors noted, every country wants to build more bridges, roads, and renewable power grids, but it will not be easy. Many such projects fail to come in on time and within the planned budget. The consequence is that public and private investment rates have stagnated with little effort to maintain aging assets. Meanwhile, environmental considerations and technological progress are creating vast demand for renewable energy systems, more efficient transport systems, and better communication networks. Infrastructure projects warrant more scrutiny because they're often big-ticket items. When they fail, it becomes a public issue. The reasons are diverse. They range from absorptive capacity constraints, land disputes, cost overruns, weak support from the private sector, and deficiencies in a country's macroeconomic or sectoral policy. We structured this along three themes. The first has to do with the challenges and risks in trying to increase returns to infrastructure investment. The second are the tools. What do you do? How can you address these challenges? And finally, the impact. What do you get out of this? How do you maximize spillover effects? And these are important. They'll affect the returns of the project, the sector, the economy, society in general. We have four splendid panelists today representing a wide range of interests and backgrounds. Mr. Salian represents the Ministry of Finance in India, a major infrastructure investment country. Former Minister of Finance Gala from Egypt, colleague of mine at the World Bank, has written extensively about factors that affect infrastructure investments. Mrs. Deepak Khanna represents the Rockefeller Foundation, the role that nonprofits, civil society has on influencing the course of infrastructure investments. Mr. Andrew Cross, representing AIIB, deals with financial sector returns, with particular mandates dealing with structuring of financing for infrastructure, the role of the private sector. How do you get better returns out of this? So let's start off with the opening statements on terms of challenges. Mr. Salian, India holds a very large infrastructure project portfolio. Based on your experience, What are the most common challenges faced by implementing agencies?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank the AIIB team and the organizers for having me here. Yes, as you rightly said, India is one of the largest client countries, in most of the multilateral development banks. Just before highlighting the challenges, I just say there is always a limited lending headroom from the MDB side. On the other side, there is always limited borrowing capacity on the member countries also. So now how to balance these two headrooms, headroom of lending and headroom of sort of borrowing. In that sense, the first important challenge would be always the prioritization. You have limited resources, as I said, not only resources in terms of financial angle, but also in terms of the capacity. So within the limited resources and capacity, how to prioritize projects is the first typical challenge for any of the implementing agencies. Once we have that clarity on that, prioritize the projects, then whether we to avail resources from the multilateral development banks or external agencies or the domestic sources of funding. Now, when you look into it, we need to have a cost-benefit assessment of these two various sources, particularly considering what is the value addition we are going to get. So that is the first important challenge. What I see is the prioritization. Then the important challenge is in terms of lack of assessment in terms of resources and again capacity. So assessment of these resources is also important. The implementing agencies, they know that there is a limited resources and capacity, but how to assess that? And what is that sort of gap which is to be filled by these multilateral agencies or other funding agencies? So that assessment is important challenge what we see. The third one I would rather see is, and from the PIA's perspective, is in terms of lack of synergy or what we call no synergy. For example, I give an example of a particular province having multiple projects from different multilateral banks. One project, for example, we say on livelihood generation. On the other project is typical infrastructure project, as you mentioned, construction of bridges, the roads, etc. Now, when we prepare or plan a project from the province perspective, and one project is funded by a particular multilateral bank and the other project is by another multilateral bank, unless we build a synergy between these various facets of development, whether it is a livelihood generation, irrigation, or water resource related activities, or typical hard physical infrastructure, unless we build that, the larger benefits we are supposed to get is restricted. So this is an important challenge what we see. And the fourth one is in terms of the exit strategy, assessment of the benefits of these various development, finance projects or the external aided projects, what we call. And so unless we have a very clear-cut exit strategy, at what stage the lending agency should be out of the one whole project cycle structure, and what stage they should give sort of right sort of direction in terms of the capacity building skill set of the personnel. So unless we have a very clear-cut exit strategy in the part of the design itself, then we are not expected to get a very good outcome. So this is the fourth important challenge. And the fifth and the last one I would rather restrict at this stage on this thing is in terms of the capacity, particularly the technical capacity deficit. This is where the role of multilateral development banks is important. This is where we have, I said, whether to go for, when you are prioritizing, go for external aided projects or sources of funding or domestic sources of funding. And if you are relying on a multilateral development financing, the ability of these lending agencies in terms of bringing capacity and transfer of knowledge and technology will really help in terms of addressing that part. So that is, so filling that technical deficit or technical capacity deficit is important aspects from the project implementing agency's perspective. With these broad sort of challenges, let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Salian. I think you've highlighted from a borrower's perspective what I would call the life cycle of a whole project. Establishing the priorities. What are your capacities? What are the needs of the sector? How do you coordinate it? How do you exit? How do you translate a project into what I call the normal policies of your country? And each stage, there's a lot to be done. I think that's very, 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 very helpful. Mr. Gala, can you help us on challenges relating to government efficiency, governance issues? How do these prevent the maximization of returns on infrastructure investments for our country and for the world in some ways? No, sorry.
Can you switch it on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, I can sing. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Huang, and thank you all for coming. I realize it's lunchtime and we are competing with something that's difficult to resist. So thank you so much for coming. Now, the question that was posed now, I mean, we heard a lot of challenges from His Excellency the Minister, from my colleague here from India. But the question that's posed to me is a bit more concrete. It has to do with the governance capacity or the efficiency or lack thereof of governments to manage whatever investment resources they get from outside in such a way that's as effective, as efficient as possible to maximize the returns on investment in infrastructure, which is a noble objective that we all aspire to have, whether we are in the borrowing side or the lending side. Let me start off by giving you the good news. The good news is that this is an interesting story because it starts from two parties wanting something that's consistent with each other. Let's say the AIIB. I am having difficulty saying AIIB. If you are like me, just use double I. I heard it yesterday and I quite liked it. AIIB, they want to fulfill their mandate. They have resources and they want to put it in such a way as effective serving development as possible. Interestingly enough, on the other side, countries are also interested in having these resources because most developing countries, including mine and yours, have fiscal deficits, high debt. We need extra resources. Our savings rate domestically typically are relatively low. Therefore, we need injections of resources from outside. That's the good news. What is not so good news, you had a long list of challenges. I want to focus on the governance of the environment of infrastructure in particular. And I would like to because that's too big, it's too wide, it's very difficult to put your hand there. And the list can be long or short, depends on who you are and what you want to say. But I like to think of them along three dimensions. The first one, we are talking about infrastructure. You need to worry about what I would call the policy design, policy and regulatory design. Government's first job in the infrastructure business is to make sure that they have a framework for operators in that sector. That's number one. Number two, once they have these policies, who are the implementing agencies? Are they actually doing it well? Are they effective? Are they independent? And so on and so forth. And the third one has to do with something that you will not hear elsewhere. So what I call government capacity to commit, credible commitments. Typically, investment in infrastructure, as we all know, lasts for a long period of time, 20 years at a minimum. However, politicians and governments, they do change during that period. And in an investor, whether it's a multinational or a private, local, or whoever, wants to know that these rules and regulatory rules are going to be in place and they are going to be respected once the government changes. So government, the challenges in my view is really essentially how to design good policy and regulatory regime. 2 is how to implement these policies in an effective way. And 3, how governments can make credible commitments. On the design of policies, it's not always true, policies and regulations, it's not always true that any policy is fine. No. It is also not true that you can do it on a project-by-project basis. So I have a little bit of a difficulty, and you will hear me come back to that point later on, dealing with infrastructure on a project-by-project basis. I think it's a wrong approach. So you need a policy and regulatory framework that governs the operation of the sector, whether it's transport, telecom, electricity, what have you. You have to have a framework, and then whoever wants to operate in that sector, most welcome, under the same rules. You worry too much about the transaction, you're wasting your time. You're getting it right, even if you get it right, you're getting it right in one case, but you may not get it right in so many other cases. So there is no substitute, in my view, about that governments need to have a good policy and regulatory framework for the entire sector, period. Second of all, you need to have what people call, the people who are familiar with the literature on industrial organization and network industries, you need to worry about an independent regulatory agency. If you don't have an independent regulatory agency, you get 2 things. You get the rest of the government, other parts of the government, intervening inappropriately, in my view, and making life difficult for whoever is operating in that sector. And second of all, you get what, political interference creep. The government wants to keep the prices down, therefore they don't allow the price to go up, the return on investment in these sectors goes down, and you discourage the current investors and the future ones. So you have to have an independent regulatory body. And then finally, on the issue of commitment, that I mentioned earlier, that's my last point, Mr. Chair. Commitment is a funny word. I can swear that I am going to make your life happy. Are you going to believe me? I'm not sure. What is the evidence that I am going to fulfill my promise? There is no. So investors in general look for a way of locking that in. And when they don't believe that the local government arrangements will give them that credible commitment, they resort to external anchors. So arbitration in an international arbitration court in Washington. I know of one little example, Cables and Wireless in Jamaica. That's a British company that wanted to invest in the network telecom companies in Jamaica. In Jamaica, the political regimes change every cycle, and every new government would reverse all the decisions taken by the previous government. Cables and Wireless scratched their head and said, well, that's not going to work for me. I need to have a way of locking in whatever agreement I'm making with them somewhere else. They decided to have a clause in the agreement that any disputes are going to be settled in an arbitration court in London. Credible commitment is an issue, is a serious challenge for countries interested in. So anyway, I think I gave you enough challenges. I said nothing about how you go around them, but that's what the chairman told me, just challenges. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gala. You provide a very unique insight because you combine what I call the economist and professional analysis of the work you did at the World Bank decades ago, and then the practical realities when you became Minister of Finance in Egypt and trying to have to deal with these issues. And I think that you highlighted this key role that how regulatory regimes, sectoral macro policies make or break the success of infrastructure projects, and I think it's a very important point. Mrs. Khanna, can you bring to us the perspective of the Rockefeller Foundation? You've committed or intend to commit over $1 billion over the next 5 years to address climate change, its implications for infrastructure investment. What challenges does the foundation face in trying to implement this strategy?
Thank you so much, and it's such a privilege to be here with all of you and to be on this plenary. So thank you to the AIIB team. The foundation is 111 years old, and our mission has been to serve the well-being of humanity. One is seeing transformations when you're looking at climate resilience work happening, and we're seeing more of it happening in the wealthier nations. But even there, though there's a lot of progress that's happening, but what we are seeing is that the ability of the marginalized communities within these countries to really benefit from it is still, there's a long journey that has to be that happen. So the foundation, we really feel very strongly that a lot more needs to be done. If that's the situation with the wealthier countries, then what's the needs of the emerging economies, developing economies, really need to be much more strategic so that we're really able to address the needs of the vulnerable communities who are being left behind. As a result of it, we made this $1 billion commitment. We made that commitment last year at the UN General Assembly. This commitment is for 5 years, and it's really to deal with the climate crisis that we're facing right now. Our climate strategy has 2 important pillars. The first one is we really want to get the world together to be able to really put all its might behind dealing with this crisis, because none of us can do it alone. And the second important piece is how do we really ensure that the climate transition opportunities become equitable and really serve the billions of people who are being left behind. How do we do that? We really are prioritizing 4 systems, one being the food system, the other one is the energy system, the third one is the health systems, and of course climate finance, which is needed. When it comes to the food systems, we're really trying to see how we can transform the food systems so that they can really nourish people and planet. When it comes to the energy systems, we're seeing how we can accelerate renewable energy and energy transition to really see how every single individual on the planet can really benefit from the modern economy. We heard the statistics from Rwanda that, renewable energy is still 70%. So we are very much with you, Minister. How do we get to 100%? Because that's the only way that you'll really ensure economic development happens equitably across the country. When it comes to the climate finance, we are looking at how do we really unlock the billions of dollars, if not trillions, that are needed, and how do we, again, work towards a more equitable global economic recovery program. On the health side, we're really trying to see how we can advance innovations, because we're seeing with climate crisis, whether it's heat strokes or flooding, there's a lot more that needs to be done. At a systems transformation level, the critical challenges that we are seeing is that, a recent study that we did with BCG, only 16% of finance is actually flowing towards climate, and that's not enough. And also the commitments are actually going either to mitigation, mainly to mitigation, adaptation, it's still a long way to go. But also what we're seeing is that in terms of looking at the interconnectedness of how climate is impacting people and planet, there's very little financing flow that's going there. And that's where the foundation, with our $1 billion commitment, are really trying to see the intersectionality. The second important challenge that we are seeing is capacity, which has already been highlighted. And I think, we are assuming that across the ecosystem, starting with the government itself, the capacities exist to deal with the climate crisis. More and more, we're learning that that's not happening. We're very excited about the work that we're doing with the Indian government, with the Capacity Building Commission, where we are part of the journey of really building up capacities around the public sector employees for them to have a better understanding of understanding not just what the climate crisis is about, but also how can the policies and the regulatory framework really speak to what is the need of the hour. The next important challenge that we're facing is that we all talk a lot about collaboration, but it's not easy. It's really, really hard. And I think, that's where we are seeing the significant opportunity. What we should be really driving towards is more public-private philanthropic collaborations, because each of the ecosystem actors is getting different elements into this collaboration that can really help us deal with the kind of challenges that we are being confronted with. So when you look at a foundation like ours, we are using our resources as high-risk capital. We can do a lot more grants. We can give grants, we can do guarantees, we can do loans. We have the multilateral development banks, which have the possibilities of coming out with innovative financing mechanisms. And then, of course, we have the private sector and the public sector that can really scale the solutions. So how do we really work towards making these public-private philanthropic collaborations a reality to deal with the challenge that we have is absolutely critical. Let me share two examples which, definitely show that, it's possible. At COP27, there were three foundations that came together and pooled in $1.5 billion, namely the Bezos Earth Fund, IKEA Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And we've been able to get 9 investment institutions to be able to get another $9 billion into this platform. These institutions are the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, the European Investment Fund, Inter-American Development Bank, and I can go on. So, it's really been exciting to see how people have been able to pool their resources to address 3 important issues. First is, how do we provide energy access to 1 billion people? The second one is, how do you reduce carbon emissions by 4 billion tons? And the third one is, how do you create 150 million green jobs? Now, having said that, it hasn't been easy, but it's been possible. So I feel like, there has been this collaboration is up and running. How do we really make sure we have more collaborative efforts? I also want to highlight another collaborative effort, which is announced with AIIB at COP28, where we are working very close. We means the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is something that the Rockefeller Foundation has seeded. We entered into a strategic investment partnership where we want to be unlocking more than $1 billion to really ensure that we can be investing in green energy transition and renewable energy projects, both within the private and public sector. So I've highlighted some of the challenges, but I've also shared some of the successful examples that are there. And that's why we at the foundation remain very optimistic, because there is a way, but I think we really need to go beyond just looking at how do we bring about incremental change. The need of the hour is really transformational change. So that's what we're very optimistic, and I hope that these conversations are going to lead to that.
Thank you very much. Especially appreciate the fact that you pointed out how institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, civil society, can bring additional focus to issues like equity, environmental sustainability, how these concerns can be factored into the interaction between the private and public sector. I think it's a major challenge for everyone. Mr. Andrew Cross, Chief Financial Officer for AIIB, you have particular responsibilities and importance in trying to foster collaboration between the public and private sector and trying to make sure that social and environmental considerations are also part of the agenda in addition to the economic returns and financial returns. How do you see these challenges?
So I've been puzzling over this question for a little while. And while all of you in the audience had the luxury of lunch, I'm sitting here quite hungry at the moment, which allegedly should make me more alert. But
Hungry, but not angry.
Yes, but it means my blood sugar levels are not brilliant at the moment. I'm also reminded of the fact that when I came into the community, the multilateral development bank space, almost 20 years ago, I remember a senior member of the World Bank leadership team essentially saying, MDBs were in the business of hope, right? That if you look at the size of the challenge, whether it's development, whether it's poverty alleviation, we essentially, through our daily efforts, believe that the institutions, which is a sum total of the inspired contribution of all the staff, will lead to a better planet according to a wide range of standards, benchmarks, and measures. And in my personal life, I'm an exciting, happy, cheerful individual. In my professional life as the CFO, I see generally a different world. I generally just face risks each day. So let me expand on that. The challenge we all know is generational. MDBs, with their AAA ratings, are built to be generational, right? Pretty factual statement. If you leak capital, if you make bad investments, if you give your money away, it seems you've got little chance of being generational. And in the way that the panel have made really good points, our owners, the 109 countries that essentially own AIIB, expect us to keep turning up every year for several generations. So the point is made that, you know, basically infrastructure assets are a generational asset, right? I mean, if they're 20, 25 years, if you define a generation as 25 years, we have to be around for multiple generations. So that means that we have to be hugely disciplined about the utilization of our capital. One, because it has to last for generations, and two, most importantly, because it's essentially rare treasure that has been given to us by the 109 countries. So if you look at the 109 countries that are members, huge disparity in income, in credit, in development, right? And they have given to AIIB this relatively really important part of their national assets to the bank to make a difference with, right? So we have enormous responsibility. In order to do the bank's job, we have to have a AAA rating, all right? AIIB has 3 AAA ratings, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P, right? Which leads to the board having to decide what's its risk appetite. How much of the capital does it want to risk, right? And the point made by my friends is that, you know, equity is high risk, right? I'm sure if there were windows in this room, we would look outside and see a beautiful sunny day. And in this environment, it's really easy to say we have a high risk appetite, except for the unfortunate thing that risk has a habit of turning up, and the loss turns up, and the loss erodes capital. So I would come at the question a little bit differently. I do not see the role of the MDBs in increasing returns for an asset class, right? I do think MDBs have a very, very significant role in creating an appropriate risk-adjusted return environment, right? So the comments that have been made rightly around policies is very much going to the risk component of that. Right? It's very easy in absolute terms to increase return when you just hike up tariffs. I don't know that that's a responsible way of developing assets. If you also think about MDB's business models, on the sovereign lending side, we are a cooperative. We do not price for credit risk, right? We pass on the AAA rating credit cost directly on average to BB counterparties. That's an enormous saving which goes directly into development. On the private side, so coming to the question, we price according to the market. If we don't price according to the market, then we distort the market. And it's always typically the distortion is the wrong side, right? So if we underprice, then essentially we crowd out the private sector. And where is the sense in that? AIIB has $100 billion of rare capital. If you said, and the numbers are always massive, right? Like 2013, there's a very famous study that says the infrastructure gap in Asia is between, well, 2 different studies, between 3 and 5 trillion. All right. Now add, since 2016, 23.5% inflation. And then also add, probably in all likelihood, the challenge of not achieving 1.5 degrees. And infrastructure is directly involved. It gets more expensive as a consequence of those 2. Right? So the practical reality is that the only way you can solve the infrastructure challenge is by the involvement of the private sector. In real terms, in absolute terms, capital in proportionality resides in the private sector. So I think our role is creating an appropriate risk-adjusted environment for investors to come in. And if I finish, because I know I've been really successful in limiting my comments to my 3 minutes, that there is I don't see a conflict between returns and development. I do not see a conflict between appropriate returns and appropriate E&S standards. Responsible investors want to apply the best E&S standards that are around. There is no schizophrenia around this debate. But what can MDBs do using very rare, valuable treasure to create an environment, an incentive that allows the private sector to come in and invest, successfully invest, so they keep successfully investing.
Thank you. Yeah, you've also given us a jolt to reality in terms of how to assess risk and what's the appropriate role of institutions like the AIIB. I think the concept of returns is also a broad one. The commercial returns, there are social returns. Value can be measured in many different ways. So that just adds to what I call the complexity of the challenge, because there are so many things you have to actually look at. Let's get to the solution portion. What are the tools? What are the means we have to address these challenges? What can we expect to be the result, the impact, the benefits to the country and to society as a whole? And Mr. Salian, let me start with you. India, you have this concept of Finance Plus. You have various means to address or to increase the returns to infrastructure investments. You have a huge portfolio of such projects to look at. You must have a tremendous challenge also in assessing the results. How do you measure it? What kind of indicators do you use? What can you do to shed insight into some of these issues from an India perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. Going back to my initial comment on the exit strategy, when you're looking at one of the challenges of the implementing agencies. The other challenge for you, for us, for example, from the, say, for example, Ministry of Finance is deciding on the entry point of the multilateral development banks. I think you mentioned about the policy and regulatory aspects and other things, because when we look at the multilateral development bank, we look at a whole package, right? The upstream services, the midstream services, and the downstream services. And the upstream services, what we are called the policy guidance and the influence of MDBs in terms of bringing changes in the regulatory system, the institutional aspects, and so on. So which are those set of banks which will bring that sort of value addition to us is one aspect we look into it. And similarly, the second point is the midstream services, and the point you rightly mentioned in terms of the Finance Plus. This is another important component of Finance Plus, where the technical assistance part, the transfer of knowledge, the transfer of technology, and strategic partnership. That is the important aspect. These are all the various elements of the Finance Plus component which we look into it. And from the borrowing perspective, we always try to have a very strategic partnership with various multilateral banks. Some banks have their comparative advantage in set of, for example, AIIB has a comparative advantage in terms of typical infrastructural finance. And some other, for example, IFAD, International Fund for Agriculture Development, they have their own niche areas in terms of rural development, agriculture, livelihood, and so on. So again, I said in the initial remarks about synergy. So building synergy is also a part of this Finance Plus exercise. These are some of the key aspects we take into account. And I try to differentiate Finance Plus with the Budget Plus. There is also an aspect we look into it as a Budget Plus component. It is the ability of multilateral development banks or the international financial agencies to mobilize additional resources, not only from the private sector, because obviously private sector, we are hearing from the governors and all the, participants on the importance of the private sector and the private capital mobilization. The other abilities also of multilateral banks in terms of mobilizing resources available in the various departments of the same government. And that is about convergence part, which convergence resources from different departments. This is important, particularly from the in the designing stage itself. Whether mobilization of resources from the private sector on the one side, and efficient and judicious use of resources available in the domestic sources within the government. So we also looking forward to have that sort of services from multilateral banks. So these all depends on at what stage multilateral banks enter into that whole project cycle, right? Whether even beyond the project cycle, right? I mean, I understand it is not should not be a project to project approach. It should be sort of building all the multilateral development bank reforms, talking about developing a country system. MDB is working as a system and developing country system. Not that it should not be seen as AIIB portfolio, World Bank's portfolio, and ADB's portfolio. It is about converging all these resources and giving multilateral banks giving a complete package to a member country. So considering all these aspects of midstream, upstream, and downstream. So that is why we slowly shifting our focus from purely from a borrowing perspective. See, resources, I mean, as I said, yes, initially it is always a balancing act of where to find, whether it's from the domestic sources or the, external sources. But I mean, today it's because of the environment of the interest rate and other things. In some of the cases, countries, the domestic sources are cheaper than multilateral banking borrowings. So then it is about strategic alignment. What is that AIIB in this particular case, say, for example, bring that value addition to the member countries, which is, so strategically we decide that when we decide the finance plus element. So not purely from the direct lending by the MDBs, but it is beyond that. Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Gala, you hinted at earlier that the importance of sectoral policies in shaping the returns to investment. And you also brought in the concept of whether we should be focusing on projects, because I think you're trying to talk about the flow of resources into a sector rather than whether this project by itself can achieve something. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit about this, and also how these policies can shape the role of the private sector in terms of infrastructure.
That's for me?
Yes,
or
for you.
Okay. Now we move from the making problems to trying to find solutions. So there were lots of challenges in the first segment of the discussion. We move to the other part of it. And I have to admit that I want to remind you and remind myself about the nature of the beast. What is the nature of infrastructure activities in general? One, they are characterized by what they call asset specificity. Think about a power plant and an airline. If things go bad for the owner of an airline, and travelers are not coming their way and the business is losing, what can he or she do? Just sell the airlines, take the resources, redeploy them somewhere else. Imagine that you have a power plant and things are not working well. What can you do? You are stuck. Why is that feature important in thinking about solutions is because of this concept that I advocated earlier of credibility of commitment. No one, private or anybody else, will get themselves stuck in a business they cannot run away from easily. Therefore, there is the issue of importance of credible commitment. So that's one. Second one, that also has to do with infrastructure, is the issue of natural monopolies, network. By definition, all network industries are natural monopolies, and you cannot pretend that they are not. Natural monopolies means that without regulations, they can exploit the consumers, they can increase the return, and everybody, the consumers, will be paying for it, and it's perfectly all right with them. So that is another feature that you cannot run away from. And then there is an interesting feature also that people don't always think about, which is what I would call currency mismatch. Most infrastructure activities, the revenues are in local currencies. The cost is in foreign currencies. Therefore, the issue of exchange rate risk is a very serious issue. And it has to be discussed upfront, just like the issue of credibility, just like the issue of regulation, just like the issue of exchange rate risk. All three are features of any time you want to fix the infrastructure activities and maximize the return. These features, you cannot run away from them, period. Now, given that, what choices do governments and MD Bs have. I think we talked enough about governments. So we move to the MDBs, right? I sense from what I have seen, by the way, I am new to AIIB. Therefore, I am the new kid around the block. I know very little about it, therefore I can say foolish things. So bear with me. I think they tend to be more, their mindset is probably more project focused than sectoral focused. And I find that to be a big challenge. If we were talking about challenges facing governments, this is a challenge, I believe, facing AIIB. I think we need to think hard and very carefully about how are we dealing with our engagement in infrastructure. Now, I appreciate your point that countries lived well before AIIB, you know? The world didn't start with the birth of AIIB. The world existed before. Therefore, when they go to a country and the country needs their resources, well, that's perfectly all right. You take it from where it is. I mean, they have a regulatory regime, they have a policy design, therefore you need to think, you don't need to create it. You are going there to support them without hurting yourself as a multinational development bank institution. But you start from where the countries are. And I believe that if you plunge into a project and a transaction without worrying about the ecosystem, you are not maximizing the return on your investment. And I would even argue you are not maximizing the social return of investment to the countries. So I will keep insisting on the idea that you have two ways of proceeding. One of them is to do it transaction by transaction. And I'm sorry, you're not going to go very far. You will in the short run. But eventually, although our friend Mr. Keynes said in the long run we are all dead, but you brought in the intergenerational questions. Therefore, I worry about my kids and the kids of my kids, right? So we cannot also, even for selfish reasons, run away from thinking longer term. I believe that this is the right way of doing it. AIIB cannot work alone. This is a big task. Therefore, the ideas that have been emphasized, and I've heard it quite frequently, you need to work very closely with other, the World Bank and other MDBs, but the bottom line is I call for a change of focus or orientation, even if gradually and over time. It will take reprofiling your staffing, it will take whatever it takes. But this is an idea you need to resolve now, rather than living with a way of dealing with developing countries that may not necessarily be the best way and the most optimal way of serving yourself and serving the interest of the other countries. Maybe I should say something about the private sector.
1 second.
One minute. No, 1 second is gone.
1 minute.
1 minute is okay. Now, private sector also, you have two ways of bringing them in. The multilateral development banks don't have all the resources that can satisfy the huge needs in developing countries. That's no question about it. The needs are huge, and you need to mobilize the private sector. We know that the private sector is in the business of maximizing profit, and I don't blame for it. That's their business. That's how they continue. My job as an MDB is to make sure that their interest is satisfied, but the interest of development are equally satisfied. Therefore, the idea of, you will excuse me, if you are one of these people who believe in the beauty of PPPs, public-private partnership, I'm not one of them. I'm not an admirer of PPPs. In fact, I think PPPs, I will end up, Mr. Chair, with one comment that says, contracts are imperfect by definition. Nobody can strike a contract that covers all eventualities in the future. Therefore, going the PPP, the BOT, the family of PPPs and BOTs is not going in the right direction. Thank you.
Mrs. Khanna, perhaps you can give some insights about innovative instruments that the Rockefeller Foundation has used I'd also appreciate your assessment of how successful you think institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation can be in influencing policies of multilateral development banks.
I'll start with the latter, even though it's tough. But I think as an institution, we definitely feel that, it's important. The transformation needs to happen. And in fact, for the last 2 years, we've been working very closely with Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados to really see how we can push the MDB reform agenda. We've also launched some very interesting innovation grants where MDBs have come forward, much to our surprise, to actually avail of those grants to see how they can be innovating a lot more than what they've done in the past. So as an institution, we are very committed because we do feel MDBs have to play a very important role, and how can we really be part of that journey to really bring about that reform and the architecture that's needed. And I think, we've been having very, very interesting and useful conversations with the current World Bank president, and early on in the UNGA week, we've also made some very interesting announcements around Mission 300 in Africa, where World Bank, AIIB, and the Rockefeller Foundation will be working together. And I think the more we work together, it's also then easier for us to be talking about where things are kind of need to be unblocked. So that's your latter question. And the former question, as an institution, innovative finance has been, and impact investing has been something that actually was coined by us in 2007. And since then, we've been really trying to see how, as I mentioned earlier, we're being encouraged by our board, by our president, to really look at our resources as high-risk capital. And yes, we are taking risks every day. We are putting money behind big bets, which, we haven't mapped out everything to the last T. But yes, if philanthropic foundations are not going to take risks, then who's going to take risks? So I think as an institution, that's what we've been doing, and we're very proud about that being part of our DNA. Talking about some of the examples that we've been able to actually have up and running. So I want to talk about the Zero Gap Fund. As part of the Zero Gap Fund, we've created something called a catastrophe bond, where we're really able to trigger the resources that are needed when a catastrophe strikes, And I think what's really interesting here is that we were talking about the private sector. It's not just, getting the resources available when there's a catastrophe, but what's also important is that we incentivize when you're able to avert a catastrophe. So there's a win-win situation for the private sector as well as all the other players into the part of the work that we're doing. Another example is where we've been working with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Resilience. And here we've been able to unlock millions of dollars as we speak by creating a platform for climate smart loans. And through this, what we've been able to really ensure is that poor farmers, marginalized farmers, have access to loans, and the whole climate resilience is part of the whole loan portfolio. Another example that we have is the Energy Transition Accelerator that we've actually put together with World Bank, which is really, again, mobilizing millions of dollars to be able to really fast-track energy transition, where, again, the public and private sector are benefiting. Another very exciting piece of work that we're doing is around the Coal to Clean Credit Initiative. Now, again, how do we use the carbon markets to really incentivize early closure of coal plants? And we have some very interesting work that we've seeded in Philippines, where we are actually taking the plunge of an early retirement of coal plant and working very closely with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and other actors to make that happen. So, these are all examples where we put in our resources and are very excited about it. Let me just quote one more example that we have, which is with the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, CDRI. And here again, based on our conversations with them, it was quite evident that there's a lot of public sector resources which are sitting out there, but the climate risk assessment tools aren't necessarily available. So we have invested resources to create this playbook, and we've used the existing models that you have, the GIRI tool that you have, which is really around the global infrastructure risk model, as well as the resilience index that we're using. So it's not kind of starting new stuff, but building on what there is to really be able to unlock more money and resources for the infrastructure work, which is climate resilient, is what we're doing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cross, you strike me as a very disciplined fellow. So what I want you to do is, in 2.5 or 3 minutes, give me some sense of how AIIB has been dealing with issues of risk adjustment, mobilizing the private sector, or trying to improve the quality of our projects, given the mandate of the institution.
Sure. In fact, my answer is helped by actually some really, really useful comments all the panelists have made. So if I pick one comment up that may resonate, I think all of us from our practical experience know that the soundbite of shovel-ready infrastructure is a wonderful soundbite, but the reality is that very rarely is infrastructure shovel-ready. And so project preparation funds, which AIIB is involved in, is directly focused on targeting the preparation, the capacity issues that have been, I think, highlighted really well. So how do you create a pipeline? How do you prepare the way? How do you start doing some of the studies? How do you do some of the technical transfer of knowledge? So project preparation fund that AIIB has, really important. There is a reality that in the last few years with high US dollar interest rates, there have been challenges by borrowers in making the numbers work. And so AIIB has had essentially for the last few years an interest buy-down fund, right? So it takes what might be a project that's marginally failing to marginally succeeding. And that's obviously been successful. That fund depletes very, very quickly, especially in a high interest rate environment. So that's something the bank has been involved in. We've also, people talk a lot about guarantees. We've done guarantees. So the Egyptian transaction in the Chinese market, the $500 million panda bond that we guaranteed in partnership with the African Development Bank, extremely helpful. So it goes to the point about working in partnership. And I think there's nothing like working on a transaction to work in partnership. You can, if you have meetings and you measure meetings as a deliverable, then you'll have lots of meetings. However, specific transactions is actually really where does it actually work. So the guaranteed. Then also, we also took essentially $1 billion of exposure off the World Bank's balance sheet. Again, a guarantee that AIIB was involved in using the strength of our capital base and also the strength of the origination efforts that that IBRD had been involved in over the last 15 to 20 years. That's again a nice collaborative effort. The last point I would leave you with, which goes to this concept of innovative solutions. And I'm always excited every time I get a G20 communique when I read that we should be very focused on innovative solutions. And I think there, again, specific transaction that the bank has been involved in is that one way to get the private sector involved is to turn infrastructure loans into infrastructure securities. And that's definitely one way where you can get asset managers. And if you look at a very popular transaction that people talk about is the continued success of the Bayfront transactions that were done in, based in Singapore. So those, to your answer, hopefully that's a very disciplined approach, and I've gifted you back 2 minutes.
I'm told that we actually have 5 minutes on top of these 2 minutes, which means that we can at least allow a few questions from the audience before I make some summary comments. Do we have any questions people would like to raise? Yes, back there.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Kinlock of Logie Group. I advise on infrastructure finance. That involves government policy. It involves funding. Okay, we'll start again. I'm Andrew Kinlock of Logie Group. I advise on infrastructure finance, government policy, fundraising, and acting as an expert in disputes. Can I disagree, if I'm brave, with Mr. Galal about effectiveness of PPPs? I would say that MDB's capacity is limited. You need to bring in the private sector with its much greater capacity, but I'm sure you'll agree, that needs to be done on a sensible basis. So first of all, what risk is genuinely transferred? If the government's going to pick up the pieces when a deal goes wrong, has that risk really been transferred to the private sector? And the second proviso would be that nobody knows what these deals are going to look like in 20, 30 years' time. So there's very little discussion about risk sharing on the upside. PPPs get a bad name when they go surprisingly well, and they get a bad name when they go surprisingly badly. But if the deals were structured in the first place such that both the upside and the downside risk were shared to some degree, then I think you'd be able to bring in the capital that everybody agrees ought to be brought in. So I wouldn't be quite so blanketly cautious about PPPs.
Before I ask for responses, let me see if there are any other questions. Any other comments? Yes.
Maybe just one very quick question about to Dr. Prasanna. So in India, you mentioned about one of the challenges is priority, and so based on your experience, how you balance this priority, because we also face other similar situation under member countries saying this is a priority, but many. So can you just elaborate a bit how India is dealing with this challenge? Thank you.
Any other questions before I ask the panelists to respond? My guess is that I'll turn to Mr. Gala first. I'm going to probably anticipate his response a bit by guessing that he's not saying that PPPs or these other mechanisms are not useful, but he's going to basically say that if you don't have the right policy sector environment, these instruments won't be successful. But let me let you respond on this. I say this because he's a colleague of mine, so I can add to his comments.
The chair knows me better than me. I don't know whether I would have said it as nicely, but let me actually give you an example rather than theorize. Well, we can disagree, but we'll remain friends, right? All right. I was a Minister of Finance in Egypt. We had a unit in the Ministry of Finance that's called the PPP unit that was created by my predecessor. Given my ideas that I have just spilled out, the first thing I have done when I went to the Ministry of Finance is get the group in that unit to have a meeting with me. I asked them, how much did how many contracts have you signed under the name of PPP? They told me something like 13. I said, how many of them are going well without problems? They told me 1. Then I asked him the follow-up question, what is happening with the rest? Well, we couldn't anticipate everything, and something went wrong. And now we are in Washington paying a much, much higher price penalties for, according to somebody else, violating one term of the contract or the other. I am not against the private sector participation, as our chair said. On the contrary, I actually said that domestic savings rates are typically small for most developing countries. Private capital is needed. The question is how you do it. By contrast, a country like Chile, they have the policy framework right, as far as I'm concerned, for infrastructure. Most of their activities in infrastructure are private sector. So you have 2 clear choices. One of them is to set the rules of the game and then invite the private sector to come in. And the other one is to go and make a deal with every private sector one at a time and run into a conflict and go to Washington. So I am not against, I mean, in spirit, we agree. I think we might disagree a little bit about the way we want to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Simeon?
Yeah.
I think the question is very broad, so you have to figure out how to answer it simply.
I'll be very focused. Yeah, I mean, yes, that is the point which I highlighted is in terms of the prioritization. When talking about the prioritization, there are different levels. Now, one is obviously we will have a list of projects we prioritize based on whether this particular project is transformational or not, right? And then is another set of projects where we see what is that value addition which multilateral banks which bring in. I mean, whether that will facilitate you will transfer knowledge and expertise from outside through that in the initial project design itself. So one is prioritization at the project implementing agencies level. Another one is a prioritization at the Ministry of Finance level, for example, right? before posing a project to the multilateral bank, the Ministry of Finance will decide whether it is worth posing to a multilateral development banks, what is that value addition we are going to get from that particular project if we don't utilize a domestic source of funding, right? The other way of, when you're looking at the prioritization, also in terms of the instrument which use, whether is it better to use a budgetary support funding structure or a direct investment lending, loan, or what we call the program for results, right? Whether all these projects which we have identified will fit into these various instruments of multilateral development banks, right? So this is another way which we prioritize. But at the same time, I said, every country has its own country limit, right? A single borrower's limit, what we call. So within that, how judiciously we can take advantage of MDB's expertise. As you know, as I said, project cycle, in the same side we have a life cycle of MDBs. MDB starts with, for example, AIIB starts at a purely a lending bank, slowly moving to a leveraging bank, and we are pushing them to reach a stage where it reaches a knowledge bank, right? And which World Bank and ADBs have already reached. So considering the comparative advantage of a multilateral development banks, if we are approaching a project to AIIB, we look into the comparative advantage of that particular bank and accordingly pose the project. So these are the various different dimensions of prioritization. With that, let me stop here. Thank you.
So give me 1 minute to summarize here. We begin by outlining all the risks and challenges facing both MDBs and governments in trying to deal with increasing the value of infrastructure investment projects. After hearing my panelists here for almost an hour, I came out actually more positive than I entered. Because what I see is that governments are struggling with the issue of priorities for trying to improve the value of the projects. And they're approaching it from a variety of ways, looking at the life cycle of the process, coordination, the priorities. Mr. Gala reminds us of the importance of sector policies, regulatory frameworks. If you don't have the right frameworks, your projects will not succeed no matter what you try to do. Our colleague here from Rockefeller Foundation reminds us of the critical role that institutions like the Foundation and others have in reminding us what things to consider, what we may have overlooked, how do we exchange information across institutions, really key. And Mr. Cross reminds us that the AIIB is struggling with trying to come up with policies, funding, instruments to deal with issues of risks, mobilizing the private sector, experimenting with new challenges. This reflects, I think, the complexity of the issue. As long as we have partners and institutions and people dealing with these challenges, I think we're going to be moving in a positive direction. But what we've all learned, of course, is that this is not going to be a simple process. It's going to evolve over time. So thank you for joining us. I hope you can get something to eat if you haven't eaten afterwards. Thank you very much.